Well, hello there, sleepy history buffs. Looks like you've wandered into another one of my rambling tales from the past. Picture this, it's November 1st, 1755, and you're waking up in Lisbon, Portugal. The morning sun filters through your shutters, casting warm golden light across the cobblestone streets below. You can hear church bells ringing in the distance, not the frantic, chaotic clanging they'll become in a few hours, but the peaceful rhythmic calls to morning prayer. The air smells of fresh bread from the bakeries and salt from the nearby Atlantic. It's All Saints' Day, one of the most important religious holidays in the Catholic calendar, and you're living in one of the most devout cities in all of Europe. You stretch, yawn, and probably think to yourself that this is going to be just another holy day. Maybe you'll attend Mass at one of Lisbon's magnificent churches, perhaps browse the bustling markets afterward, or take a stroll through the Grand Rocio Square. The weather is unseasonably warm and pleasant for November, with just a gentle breeze coming in from the northeast. Everything feels perfectly ordinary, perfectly safe, perfectly predictable. Here's the thing, though, you're about to experience one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in European history, and spoiler alert, you probably won't make it through the day. The earth beneath your feet is hiding a secret that's about to explode with the force of hundreds of atomic bombs, followed by a wall of water that'll make every tsunami movie look like a gentle bath topped off with fires that'll burn for days and consume 3/4 of your entire city. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how this little corner of YouTube connects people across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pull on your clothes, probably a linen shirt, woolen breeches, and leather shoes if you're a man, or a long dress with a bodice and apron if you're a woman. Fashion in 1755 isn't exactly built for running from disasters, but then again, nobody's planning for disasters today. You step outside into streets that are already bustling with activity. Lisbon in 1755 is a magnificent city of about 200,000 people, one of the largest and wealthiest in Europe, thanks to Portugal's vast colonial empire. Gold from Brazil has funded incredible architecture, and the city is full of grand palaces, ornate churches, and impressive public buildings. The royal palace dominates the riverfront, a massive complex that took decades to build and represents the pinnacle of Portuguese royal power. Nearby you can see the naval arsenal, where Portugal's mighty fleet has maintained the same fleet that has made this small nation one of Europe's great colonial powers. The custom house bustles with merchants from around the world, dealing in spices from India, gold from Brazil, and goods from Africa. But here's what you don't know as you admire all this grandeur. Lisbon sits in one of the most seismically active regions in Europe. The boundary between the African and Eurasian tectonic plates runs right offshore, and pressure has been building for centuries. Historians still argue whether there were warning signs that scientists of the time should have recognized, but earthquake science in 1755 is basically non-existent. People think earthquakes are either acts of God or caused by underground winds. The idea of tectonic plates won't be developed for another 2 centuries. As you make your way through the morning crowds, you're walking over a geological time bomb that's about to go off with a magnitude somewhere between 8.5 and 9.0, powerful enough to be felt as far away as Finland and North Africa. The epicenter is roughly 200 kilometers southwest of Cape St. Vincent, but Lisbon, sitting just 150 kilometers away, is about to take the full brunt of one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded in Europe. You have no idea that in about an hour, every assumption you have about the solid, reliable nature of the ground beneath your feet is about to be shattered, along with most of your city. You decide to attend morning mass at one of Lisbon's beautiful churches, maybe the Grand Cathedral, or perhaps one of the smaller but equally ornate parish churches scattered throughout the city. The streets are packed with people making their way to various services, families dressed in their finest clothes, children clutching their parents' hands. There's something almost magical about the atmosphere on All Saints' Day in a city as deeply religious as Lisbon. The Portuguese take their Catholicism seriously, and today is when they honor all the saints, known and unknown, who have achieved eternal glory. You push through the heavy wooden doors of your chosen church and are immediately enveloped by the cool, incense-scented air inside. Candles flicker everywhere, casting dancing shadows on the Baroque decorations that cover nearly every surface. Gold leaf gleams from altars and statues paid for with wealth flowing in from the colonies. The church is absolutely packed, standing room only in many places, which would normally feel comforting, like being part of a great community of faith. Today, it's going to be a death trap. You find a spot near one of the massive stone pillars and kneel on the hard floor along with hundreds of other worshippers. The priest begins the Latin Mass, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling high above your head. You probably don't understand much of what he's saying. Most people in 1755 don't speak Latin, but that's not really the point. This is about being present, about participating in something larger than yourself, about connecting with the divine through ritual and community. Around 9:30 a.m., something strange happens. Every church bell in the city starts ringing at once, but not in any coordinated pattern. It's chaotic, discordant, like someone is shaking the entire city like a maraca. At first, you might think it's some special part of the All Saints' Day celebration you've forgotten about. Then you notice that nobody told the bell ringers to start ringing. In fact, nobody is in the bell towers at all. The ground beneath you begins to move, not violently at first, just a subtle swaying, like you're on a ship in gentle swells. You look around and see confused faces throughout the congregation. The priest pauses mid-sentence, looking uncertain. Then the swaying becomes shaking, and the shaking becomes violent convulsions that throw you to your knees, not in prayer this time, but because standing upright has become physically impossible. Here's where your location inside a medieval church becomes a serious problem. These buildings were designed to inspire awe and demonstrate God's glory, not to withstand seismic events. The soaring stone arches the massive pillars, the heavy stone vaulting overhead. All of this is held together by gravity and careful engineering that assumes the ground will stay still. When the earth starts moving, like a bucking horse, medieval masonry doesn't bend, it breaks. You hear a sound like thunder, but it's coming from above and all around you. Cracks appear in the walls, racing upward like lightning in reverse. Chunks of stone and mortar begin raining down on the panicked congregation. The beautiful stained glass windows Those masterpieces of medieval craftsmanship explode inward in showers of colored fragments. What started as a peaceful religious service has become a scene from hell. People are screaming now, scrambling over each other to reach the exits. But here's the cruel irony. The main doors of medieval churches are usually quite narrow, designed to create a sense of transition from the worldly to the sacred, not to evacuate hundreds of people in a panic. You're caught in a human avalanche as terrified worshippers push and shove and trample each other in their desperation to escape. Above you, that magnificent vaulted ceiling is coming apart. Stone blocks that have held their positions for centuries are now falling like deadly hail. Historians still argue whether the churches or the residential buildings suffered worse damage, but from where you're crouched, trying to shield your head with your arms, it definitely feels like you picked the wrong place to seek divine protection. The earthquake lasts between 3 and 6 minutes. Accounts vary, but when you're experiencing pure terror, time becomes elastic. Those few minutes feel like hours, as your entire world literally falls apart around you. The pillar you were kneeling beside develops a crack that widens as you watch. The altar, with its precious golden decorations, tilts and crashes to the floor. The statue of the Virgin Mary that you've prayed to countless times topples and shatters. If you're lucky, and I mean extraordinarily lucky, you might make it to one of the exits before the roof comes down completely. If you're not well, let's just say that many of the people who came to church that morning to celebrate the saints ended up joining them rather more quickly than they'd planned. Assuming you've managed to avoid being crushed by falling masonry or trampled by the panicking crowd, you're now part of a desperate human river flowing toward whatever exits haven't been blocked by debris. The narrow church doorways have become bottlenecks of pure terror, with people shoving and clawing at each other in ways that would have been unthinkable just minutes ago when you were all united in peaceful worship. You're probably bleeding from cuts caused by flying glass or falling stone chips. Your ears are ringing from the thunderous noise of collapsing architecture mixed with hundreds of screaming voices. The air is thick with dust and the acrid smell of extinguished candles, though some fires are already starting from overturned braziers and oil lamps. Every instinct you have is screaming at you to get out, get away, find open space where heavy things can't fall on your head. But here's the thing about medieval churches. During catastrophic collapse, the exits don't stay exits for very long. As you fight your way toward what used to be the main door, you might discover it's now blocked by a pile of rubble 3 feet high. The beautiful carved stone archway that framed the entrance has crumbled inward, creating a deadly obstacle course of jagged rocks and splintered wood from the door itself. You and the other survivors start clawing at the debris with your bare hands pulling away stones and chunks of mortar while more material continues to rain down from above. Your fingernails break and your hands start bleeding, but you keep digging because the alternative is staying inside a building that's actively trying to kill you. Someone next to you may be a merchant you've seen in the markets, maybe a neighbor you've nodded to for years, gets struck by a falling stone and collapses. You want to help, but the survival instinct is stronger than compassion right now. The people who study historical disasters have a term for this behavioral sink. When normal social structures collapse along with the buildings, people revert to pure survival mode. The same neighbors who would normally help you carry your groceries home are now stepping on your feet and elbowing you in the ribs to get ahead in the escape queue. It's not that they've become evil, it's that the civilized part of their brains has temporarily shut down in favor of the ancient reptilian imperative to survive. You finally squeeze through a gap in the rubble, maybe a side door that's partially clear, or a hole that's been torn in the wall by the earthquake. You emerge into sunlight that seems blindingly bright after the dusty gloom inside, and you take what might be the sweetest breath of air in your entire life. But your relief lasts about 3 seconds because the world outside isn't much better than the world inside. The street that was bustling with well-dressed churchgoers half an hour ago now looks like a war zone. Buildings on both sides have partially or completely collapsed, turning the narrow medieval streets into canyons of rubble. Bodies are scattered everywhere, some clearly dead, others moaning and calling for help from under piles of stone and timber. The lucky ones are wandering around in a daze covered in dust and blood, looking like ghosts of their former selves. Here's a detail that really drives home how unprepared 18th century cities were for disasters. There's no emergency response system, no ambulances, no fire department, no coordinated rescue efforts. The concept of professional first responders won't develop for another century. When disaster strikes, you're basically on your own, along with whatever neighbors are still capable of helping. You might try to help dig someone out from under a collapsed wall, but you quickly realize you don't have the right tools or knowledge. Medieval construction used massive stone blocks held together with mortar. When it falls heavy and hard. Moving the debris requires equipment that simply doesn't exist in 1755. Historians still argue whether more people died from the initial collapse or from being trapped in places where rescue was theoretically possible but practically impossible. The air is filled with dust clouds, so thick you can barely see 20 feet in any direction. Every breath you take tastes of pulverized stone and wood. You hear voices calling out from under the rubble, some asking for help, others praying, still others just making wordless sounds of pain and fear. The psychological impact of hearing people you can't help is almost as devastating as the physical destruction around you. You start making your way through the debris-choked streets, climbing over piles of stone and timber, trying to find some open space where you might be safe. But safety is a relative concept now. Even the buildings that are still standing are cracked and weakened, ready to come down with the next strong aftershock. And speaking of aftershocks, you're going to be feeling those for days, smaller earthquakes that keep reminding you that the ground beneath your feet can't be trusted anymore. You're now stumbling through what used to be familiar neighborhood streets, but the Lisbon you woke up in this morning has been transformed into an alien landscape of destruction. That bakery where you bought fresh bread yesterday, gone replaced by a pile of rubble with a wooden oven door sticking out at an odd angle. The cobblestone street you've walked down hundreds of times is now buckled and cracked, creating treacherous gaps that could easily twist an ankle or trap a foot. Every few steps, you have to navigate around or climb over obstacles that didn't exist an hour ago. A massive stone block from someone's garden wall now sits in the middle of the street, like a bizarre monument to chaos. Wooden beams that once supported second-story floors jut out at dangerous angles, creating a forest of splinters that could impale the unwary. You're essentially playing a deadly game of three-dimensional hopscotch where every move could be your last. The human element of this obstacle course is perhaps the most disturbing part. Bodies are everywhere, some obviously dead, others injured and calling weakly for help, still others sitting in stunned silence among the ruins of their homes. You want to help everyone, but you quickly realize that's impossible. There are simply too many people in need, and too few people capable of providing aid. Medieval Lisbon has no emergency medical services, no organized rescue teams, no systematic approach to disaster response. You pass a woman sitting beside what used to be a house, holding a small child who isn't moving. She's not crying or screaming, just sitting there with a blank expression that's somehow more heartbreaking than hysteria would be. Nearby, an elderly man is methodically digging through rubble, with his bare hands calling someone's name over and over. These scenes repeat themselves on every street, creating a tapestry of individual tragedies that your mind struggles to process. Here's something historians often overlook when discussing disasters: the psychological impact of sudden role reversal. This morning, you were probably a baker, a merchant, a housewife, a craftsman, someone with a defined place in society and a clear sense of identity. Now you're just another dust-covered survivor stumbling through ruins, and all those social distinctions that seemed so important a few hours ago have become meaningless. The nobleman's palace is just as destroyed as the beggar's hovel. You might recognize some of the people you encounter in this post-apocalyptic landscape, but they're so covered in dust and changed by trauma that identification becomes difficult. That well-dressed merchant you've seen in the markets every week is now just another grimy figure picking through debris. The proud aristocrat who normally wouldn't acknowledge your existence is sitting on a pile of stones, staring at nothing with the same shell-shocked expression as everyone else. The geography of the city has literally changed. Streets you could navigate blindfolded are now unrecognizable mazes of rubble. Landmarks that helped you orient yourself, church spires, distinctive buildings, familiar fountains have either collapsed or been so damaged that they're no longer recognizable. You might find yourself completely lost in a neighborhood you've lived in for years, turned around by the new topography of destruction. And the noise, or rather the strange combination of noise and silence, is unlike anything you've ever experienced. There's the constant sound of settling debris as weakened structures continue to collapse, punctuated by the calls and cries of survivors. But underneath it all is an eerie quiet, where the normal sounds of city life used to be. No merchants hawking their wares, no horses clopping on cobblestones, no church bells marking the hours in their measured way. As you pick your way through this devastated landscape, you start to notice other survivors converging on the open spaces, squares, parks, wide streets, anywhere that offers some protection from falling debris. These gathering points become impromptu refugee camps where people huddle together for psychological comfort as much as physical safety. Historians still argue whether these spontaneous communities helped or hindered survival, but human beings are social creatures, and the instinct to cluster together during crisis runs deep. You're probably thirsty by now, and possibly hungry, but the normal infrastructure for obtaining food and water has been completely disrupted. Wells might be clogged with debris, food stores are buried under collapsed buildings, and the usual network of vendors and suppliers has been scattered to the winds. The realization that you're going to have to find new ways to meet your basic needs is starting to sink in, adding another layer of anxiety to an already overwhelming situation. But you're still alive, still mobile, still capable of rational thought. That puts you ahead of thousands of your fellow citizens who weren't so fortunate. And you're going to need every bit of that good fortune because the earthquake was just the opening act of this disaster. The real show is about to begin. You've made it to one of Lisbon's open squares, maybe the Grand Rocio, or perhaps the Terreiro do Pacho near the waterfront. These spaces, which normally serve as bustling marketplaces and social gathering spots, have now become impromptu refugee camps filled with dust-covered survivors sitting on whatever debris they can find. Everyone looks shell-shocked, staring at the destruction around them with the kind of blank expression that comes from witnessing something the human mind wasn't designed to process. The immediate terror of the earthquake has subsided, replaced by a different kind of fear, the slow-burning anxiety of not knowing what comes next. People are sharing stories of narrow escapes, comparing injuries, asking if anyone has seen their missing family members. There's a strange sense of community among the survivors, the kind of instant bond that forms when people have shared an extraordinary trauma. Social barriers that normally separate different classes have temporarily dissolved in the face of common suffering. Around 10:30 a.m., about an hour after the earthquake ended, someone near the waterfront points toward the harbor and says something that makes everyone turn to look. At first, you're not sure what you're seeing. The water in the Tagus River and the harbor beyond seems to be moving in the wrong direction. Instead of the normal gentle lapping against the shore, the sea appears to be pulling back, receding away from the land in a way that defies everything you understand about how water behaves. This is actually one of the most fascinating and terrifying aspects of the 1755 disaster, the tsunami that followed the earthquake. But here's the thing, in 1755, virtually no one in Europe understands what a tsunami is. The word itself won't be adopted into English for another century and a half. Japanese fishermen have a term for it, tsunami, meaning harbor wave, but their knowledge hasn't spread to the Atlantic world. So when you see the ocean doing something completely unprecedented, you have no framework for understanding what it means. The receding water reveals things that haven't been seen in decades, possibly centuries. Ships that sank long ago suddenly become visible on the exposed seafloor, their broken masts and rotting hulls creating an underwater graveyard that's now temporarily above ground. The stone foundations of old piers and dock structures emerge from what was previously 20 feet of water. Fish flop helplessly in the newly exposed mud, creating a surreal scene that looks like some kind of biblical miracle. Some people actually walk out onto this newly revealed seafloor, either from curiosity or in the hope of retrieving valuable items from the exposed shipwrecks. This turns out to be exactly the wrong thing to do, but how could they know there's no historical precedent in European experience for what's happening? Historians still argue whether any written records existed that could have warned people about the danger of receding ocean water, but even if such records existed, they wouldn't have been accessible to ordinary citizens. You might feel a momentary sense of wonder at this strange sight. After the horror of the earthquake, seeing the ocean expose its secrets feels almost magical, like witnessing a divine revelation. Maybe this is God's way of showing his power in a more benevolent way than the destruction of the morning. Maybe the worst is over, and now you're being granted a glimpse of hidden wonders as compensation for your suffering. But if you have any survival instincts left, something about this scene should make you deeply uneasy. Animals seem to sense it. Dogs are barking frantically. Horses are rearing and refusing to approach the water. Birds are taking flight in massive agitated flocks. The few people who have spent their lives working on the water, fishermen, dock workers, naval personnel, have expressions of growing alarm as they watch the sea behave in ways they've never seen before. The exposed seafloor stretches out much farther than seems natural. What was previously deep harbor water is now a vast expanse of wet sand and mud dotted with maritime debris. The silence is eerie too, without the normal sound of waves lapping against the shore. The waterfront has an unnatural quiet that amplifies every other sound, the cries of seabirds, the distant calls of survivors, the creaking of damaged buildings behind you. Some of the braver or more foolish survivors are already venturing out onto this temporary land, drawn by curiosity or the prospect of salvaging valuable cargo from the exposed wrecks. Children, with their natural fearlessness and fascination with the unusual, are particularly drawn to explore this new landscape. Parents are calling them back, but not necessarily from any understanding of danger, more from a general sense that after the morning's chaos, it's better to stay close together. You watch this strange scene unfold with a growing sense of unease that you can't quite articulate. Your rational mind tells you that water doesn't just disappear like this without reason, but you have no knowledge base to draw upon for understanding what that reason might be. All you know is that this day has already brought one impossible thing, the solid earth moving like liquid, so perhaps the liquid ocean behaving like solid land isn't entirely beyond the realm of possibility. You're standing there watching this bizarre spectacle of the vanished ocean when someone, maybe an old fisherman who spent his entire life reading the moods of the sea, suddenly starts shouting warnings and pointing frantically toward the horizon. At first, you can't see what has alarmed him. The exposed harbor floor still stretches out in front of you like some kind of muddy miracle, dotted with confused fish and curious treasure hunters who are picking through the revealed shipwrecks. Then you see it. Far out where the water should be, there's a line on the horizon that looks wrong somehow. It's too straight, too defined, too tall to be a normal wave. As you squint into the distance, trying to make sense of what you're seeing, that line begins to grow taller and move closer, and you realize with growing horror that all that water that mysteriously disappeared didn't actually go anywhere. It just pulled back to gather momentum for its return. The wave approaching Lisbon's waterfront is approximately 5 meters high. That's roughly 16 feet of solid water, moving with the momentum of the entire Atlantic Ocean behind it. To put that in perspective, a typical ocean wave might be 3 to 6 feet high on a rough day. This wall of water is taller than most houses, and it's moving toward shore at the speed of a galloping horse. If you've never seen a tsunami before, and remember virtually nobody in 18th century Europe, as it looks like something from mythology like Poseidon himself has decided to reclaim the land. The people who ventured out onto the exposed sea floor suddenly understand their mistake, but understanding and escaping are two very different things. They start running back toward shore, but running through knee-deep mud and sand while carrying salvaged goods isn't exactly a recipe for speed. Some of them drop their treasures and focus on pure survival. Others tragically try to hang on to their finds and lose precious seconds that they can't afford to lose. You watch this scene with the detached fascination that sometimes comes with extreme stress, your mind observing and cataloging details even as your body prepares for fight or flight mode. The wave seems to be moving both impossibly fast and agonizingly slowly at the same time. Part of you wants to believe that the people running toward shore will make it that this is just another strange sight on a day full of strange sights, that somehow everything will work out. But the mathematical reality of tsunamis doesn't care about hope or optimism. The wave is moving at roughly 200 kilometers per hour in deep water, slowing to maybe 50 kilometers per hour as it approaches the shallow coastal areas, still faster than any human can run, especially through difficult terrain. The people caught on the exposed sea floor are in a foot race. They cannot win against an opponent that doesn't get tired, doesn't slow down, and doesn't show mercy. The sound of the approaching tsunami is unlike anything you've ever heard. It's not the crash of ordinary waves breaking on a beach. It's a deep, rumbling roar that seems to come from the earth itself, like the breathing of some massive underground creature. Mixed with that primal sound are the screams and shouts of the people trying to escape, creating an audio landscape of pure terror that will haunt your dreams for years to come, assuming you survive long enough to have dreams. As the wave gets closer, you can see details that make it even more terrifying. This isn't clean ocean water. It's a churning brown mass full of debris, mud, broken wood from ships, and probably the bodies of people and animals that were caught earlier in its path. It's like a liquid landslide, a moving mountain of destruction that's going to smash into the waterfront with the force of 1,000 battering rams. The smart survivors, the ones who listen to the fishermen's warnings or who simply have good instincts, are already running away from the waterfront toward higher ground. But higher ground in central Lisbon is a relative concept. The city is built on relatively flat terrain near the mouth of the Tagus River, which means there aren't a lot of hills or elevated areas to escape to. Your best bet is to get as far inland as possible and hope that the wave loses momentum before it reaches you. Historians still argue whether the death toll from the tsunami exceeded the casualties from the earthquake itself, but from your perspective, those are academic distinctions. Right now, you're dealing with the immediate reality of a wall of water that's about to reshape the coastline and everything on it. The wave is maybe 30 seconds away from impact, and you have to make a choice. Do you try to help the people who are still running toward shore, or do you focus on your own survival and get as far away as possible? The people closest to the waterfront, the ones who were watching the spectacle from the docks and piers, suddenly realize that being curious about natural phenomena can be a fatal character trait. They start running inland, but they're starting from the worst possible position. Behind them, that 5-meter wall of water is about to turn the lower sections of Lisbon into a temporary lake filled with deadly debris. The tsunami hits the Lisbon waterfront with a sound like the world ending. If you thought the earthquake was loud, this is something entirely different. A deep grinding roar as millions of tons of water and debris smash into buildings, docks, and anything else unfortunate enough to be in the way. The wave doesn't break like a normal ocean wave. Instead, it just keeps coming, a relentless wall of destruction that pushes inland like a liquid bulldozer. You're running now, not the casual jog you might take for exercise, but the desperate heart-pounding sprint of someone who understands that the next few minutes will determine whether you live or die. Behind you, you can hear the terrible sounds of the tsunami consuming the lower parts of the city. The crash of collapsing buildings, the grinding of stone against stone, the screams of people who didn't run fast enough or far enough. The water spreads through the streets like spilled paint, following the path of least resistance, but with enough force to create its own paths when necessary. Stone walls that have stood for centuries crumble under the pressure. Wooden buildings simply disintegrate their timber, joining the growing mass of debris that the tsunami carries along like a collection of deadly projectiles. The wave isn't just water, it's a moving garbage dump of broken ships, uprooted trees, furniture, building materials, and bodies. As you run, you might glance back and see something that defies belief. The naval arsenal, one of the most important military installations in Portugal, is being systematically destroyed by the advancing water. Ships that represent years of skilled craftsmanship and significant financial investment are being tossed around like toys in a bathtub. The custom house, where merchants from around the world conduct their business, disappears beneath the surge. Centuries of accumulated wealth and infrastructure are being erased in minutes. But here's where your morning of disaster-related exercise pays off. All that climbing over earthquake rubble and navigating destroyed streets has warmed up your muscles and sharpened your survival instincts. You're not running blindly, you're thinking tactically, looking for higher ground, avoiding narrow streets where the water might funnel, and gain speed, staying away from buildings that look like they might collapse if nudged by a tsunami. The water is fast, but it's not infinitely fast. As the tsunami moves inland, it starts to lose momentum, slowed by friction and the sheer volume of debris it's accumulated. What started as a 5-meter wall gradually becomes a 4-meter surge, then 3 meters, then 2. But even 2 meters of fast-moving water filled with debris is more than enough to kill you if you're caught in it. You're probably not alone in your desperate flight inland. Other survivors who understood the danger are running alongside you, creating an impromptu community of the terrified. There's no time for conversation, but there's a weird solidarity in shared panic. Everyone is helping everyone else in small ways, pointing out obstacles, warning about dangerous footing, pulling up someone who stumbles. The psychological impact of being chased by a wall of water is difficult to overstate. Humans are terrestrial creatures. We're comfortable on solid ground and generally regard large bodies of water with a healthy respect. Having the ocean chase you through city streets triggers some very primal fears about drowning, about being swept away, about losing control of your environment. Your ancestors survived by being smart about avoiding predators, but nobody in your genetic lineage prepared you for being hunted by geography itself. As you run, you start to see evidence of the tsunami's power in the debris field it's creating. Boats that were safely moored in the harbor this morning are now sitting in the middle of streets, carried inland like oversized bath toys. A ship's anchor, probably weighing several tons, has been deposited in what used to be a residential neighborhood. The force required to move objects like that is almost incomprehensible. Historians still argue whether the 1755 tsunami was the largest ever to hit the European Atlantic coast, but from your perspective, size comparisons are irrelevant. This is the only tsunami you've ever experienced, and it's more than enough to convince you that the ocean is not humanity's friend. The wave that seemed almost majestic from a distance becomes a dirty, debris-filled monster when you're close enough to smell the mud and seaweed and worse things that it carries. You're starting to feel the physical effects of sustained terror and exertion. Your heart is pounding so hard you can feel it in your throat. Your lungs are burning from the combination of running and breathing air that's thick with moisture and dust. Your legs are getting shaky from the adrenaline, but you can't afford to slow down because the water is still advancing, still claiming more territory with each passing moment. The sound is following you too, that terrible grinding roar punctuated by crashes as the wave encounters new obstacles. Every time you think you might be far enough inland to be safe, you hear another building collapse behind you, another reminder that the tsunami isn't finished with Lisbon yet. You've managed to outrun the immediate reach of the tsunami, but as you catch your breath in what you hope is a safe area, maybe a small hill or just far enough inland that the water has finally stopped advancing, you notice something that makes your heart sink even further. Smoke. Not just a little smoke from a few scattered fires, but thick black columns rising from multiple points across the city. What you're witnessing is the birth of what will become one of the most devastating urban fires in European history. Here's the thing about 18th century cities that modern people often don't fully appreciate. They're essentially giant tinderboxes waiting for a spark. Most buildings are made of wood with thatched or wooden shingle roofs. The narrow medieval streets act like chimneys creating wind tunnels that can spread flames incredibly quickly. And Lisbon in 1755 has just experienced the perfect storm of fire-starting conditions, thousands of overturned candles, cooking fires, oil lamps, and braziers scattered by the earthquake, plus damaged buildings full of combustible materials and no functioning fire suppression system. The fires start small and scattered a candle that fell onto some hay in a stable here, an overturned cooking pot that ignited wooden furniture there. But fire has a way of finding other fire, especially when helpful winds are blowing to carry sparks and embers from building to building. And wouldn't you know it, that gentle northeast breeze that felt so pleasant this morning has picked up speed throughout the day, turning from a refreshing zephyr into a fire-spreading menace. You watch in fascination and horror as individual fires begin to merge into larger blazes. That bakery, where the oven was knocked over, is now a pillar of flame that's spreading to the adjacent buildings. The church where you narrowly escaped being crushed is now burning like a massive torch. Its wooden roof supports feeding flames that reach toward the sky like fiery prayers. The irony isn't lost on you. The house of God has become a beacon of destruction. What makes this particularly terrifying is the complete absence of any organized firefighting response. London had established fire brigades after the Great Fire of 1666, but Lisbon in 1755 has no such system. When fires start, the standard response is for neighbors to form bucket brigades, passing water from wells or the river to throw on the flames. But most of your neighbors are dead injured or scattered. The wells are clogged with earthquake debris, and the river area has just been devastated by a tsunami. You're essentially watching a city commit suicide by fire, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop it. The few able-bodied survivors who try to fight the fires quickly realize they're attempting to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. Water that might have been effective against a single burning building is useless against dozens of fires spreading simultaneously across multiple neighborhoods. As the afternoon progresses, the individual fires start connecting, creating what firefighters call area ignition, essentially large sections of the city becoming single massive blazes. The heat becomes intense enough that you can feel it from blocks away. The air fills with smoke so thick that breathing becomes difficult and visibility drops to just a few yards. You find yourself coughing constantly, your eyes streaming tears that have nothing to do with emotional distress. The wind, which has been steadily increasing throughout the day, turns into fire's best friend and humanity's worst enemy. It carries burning embers across streets, over walls onto rooftops that were previously safe. Buildings that survived both the earthquake and the tsunami now fall victim to flying sparks that land in exactly the wrong places. Historians still argue whether the fires were primarily spread by wind or by the collapse of burning buildings onto adjacent structures, but from your smoke-stained perspective, the distinction seems academic. You start to notice that the fire has its own weather system. The intense heat creates updrafts that pull in air from the surrounding areas, which feeds more oxygen to the flames, which creates more heat, which creates stronger updrafts. It's a positive feedback loop that turns individual building fires into neighborhood-consuming infernos. The technical term is firestorm, but that won't be coined for another couple of centuries. By mid-afternoon, you realize that running from the fires is becoming as important as running from the earthquake and tsunami were earlier. The flames are advancing almost as relentlessly as the wave did, consuming everything in their path and leaving behind a landscape of ash and skeletal building frames. Streets that you escaped to earlier in the day are now untenable due to smoke and heat. The psychological impact of watching your entire city burn is almost worse than the immediate physical danger. This morning, you woke up in one of Europe's great capitals, a center of culture and commerce and religious devotion. Now you're watching centuries of human achievement being reduced to smoke and ashes in the space of a few hours. The royal palace symbol of Portuguese power burning, the opera house where aristocrats gathered for entertainment burning, the libraries with their irreplaceable manuscripts and books burning. As night falls over what remains of Lisbon, you find yourself in a surreal hellscape that would make Dante reconsider his descriptions of the inferno. The fires that started as scattered blazes in the afternoon have now merged into a citywide conflagration that turns the night sky orange and red. You can see the flames from miles away, creating a false dawn that will continue for the next 3 days. The heat is so intense that you can't get within several blocks of the main fire zones, and the smoke is so thick that breathing without covering your nose and mouth becomes nearly impossible. This is when the true scope of the disaster begins to sink in. You're not dealing with a fire that will burn out in a few hours. This is a sustained inferno that will consume roughly 3/4 of Lisbon before it's finished. To put that in perspective, the Great Fire of London in 1666, which people still talk about as one of history's great urban disasters, destroyed about 13,200 houses. The Lisbon fire will ultimately destroy more than 27,000 buildings, making it larger in scope than London's famous conflagration. The night brings no relief from the heat and terror. If anything, the contrast between the burning city and the dark sky makes the whole scene more nightmarish. You can see the silhouettes of people moving against the backdrop of flames, some trying to save possessions from buildings that aren't yet burning, others simply wandering in shock through a landscape that no longer resembles the city they knew this morning. You're probably gathered with other survivors in one of the few areas that seems relatively safe from the advancing fires, maybe the large open space of Rossio Square, or perhaps somewhere on the outskirts of the city where the flames haven't yet reached. These improvised refugee camps are studies in human resilience and breakdown. Some people are organizing themselves, sharing food and water, trying to help the injured. Others are sitting in catatonic silence, overwhelmed by the sheer scope of what they've witnessed. The social fabric of the city has completely unraveled. The normal hierarchies and class distinctions that governed daily life this morning seem absurd in the face of universal catastrophe. Aristocrats and beggars are huddled together under the same smoky sky, equally homeless, equally traumatized, equally uncertain about whether they'll survive the night. The earthquake made everyone equal in terror. The fires are making everyone equal in loss. Here's where the timing of the disaster becomes particularly cruel. November 1st is All Saints' Day. Remember, one of the most important religious holidays in the Catholic calendar. The people of Lisbon went to church this morning to honor the saints and seek divine blessing. Instead, they've watched their most sacred buildings burn along with everything else. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. How do you reconcile your faith in a benevolent God with watching him apparently destroy his most devout city on his most holy day? Religious explanations for the disaster start flying immediately, and they're all over the map. Some Catholic priests are declaring that God is punishing Lisbon for harboring freethinkers and atheists, those dangerous Enlightenment philosophers who dare to question religious authority. Others suggest it's punishment for the Inquisition's excesses, divine retribution for centuries of religious persecution. Protestant observers from other parts of Europe see it as God's judgment on Catholic corruption and superstition. But here's the thing that really challenges everyone's theological assumptions. The fire seems to be particularly attracted to religious buildings. Churches, monasteries, convents, structures that should theoretically enjoy divine protection are burning with special intensity. The Carmo convent, the patriarchal cathedral, dozens of parish churches that have stood for centuries, all going up in flames like ordinary wooden buildings, with no miraculous intervention to save them. Historians still argue whether the religious buildings burned more readily because they contained more combustible materials, wooden pews, tapestries, centuries of accumulated decorations, or whether it just seemed that way because their destruction was more psychologically devastating to witness. But from your smoke-stung perspective, watching sacred spaces burn is adding spiritual trauma to physical terror. Some survivors are interpreting the disaster as a sign that the end times have arrived. After all, what else could explain the earth shaking, the ocean rising, and fire consuming everything in the space of a single day? Apocalyptic fever spreads through the refugee camps as people try to make sense of events that seem to exceed the boundaries of normal human experience. Street corner prophets emerge proclaiming that this is divine judgment and that everyone needs to repent immediately to avoid eternal damnation. Others are having the opposite reaction. If God exists, and this is his handiwork, then maybe he's not the benevolent, loving deity they've been taught to worship. Maybe the philosophers who question religious authority have a point. Maybe blind faith isn't the virtue it's been cracked up to be. The intellectual earthquake that will reshape European thought is beginning in the minds of traumatized survivors who are watching their world literally burn. You're witnessing what historians will later recognize as a turning point in Western civilization, the moment when the optimistic faith of the early Enlightenment crashes into the brutal reality of meaningless suffering. The philosophical reverberations of this single day will influence thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Kant, ultimately contributing to the decline of unquestioning religious authority and the rise of more skeptical, humanistic worldviews. The fires burn for 3 more days, and you spend that time in a strange purgatory between the world that was and whatever world is going to emerge from these ashes. Sleep becomes almost impossible, partly because of the physical discomfort of camping in the open with minimal supplies, but mostly because of the psychological impact of watching everything you've ever known slowly disappear into smoke. When you do manage to doze off, you're jolted awake by the sound of another building collapsing or another section of the city succumbing to the flames. By the time the fires finally burn themselves out, having consumed everything combustible in their path, Lisbon looks like a lunar landscape dotted with the skeletal remains of stone buildings. 3/4 of the city gone. The royal palace, which took decades to build and represented the pinnacle of Portuguese architectural achievement, reduced to blackened walls and piles of rubble. The opera house, the libraries, the customs house, countless churches and homes and businesses, all transformed into ash and memory. The immediate aftermath is when the true scope of human adaptability reveals itself. Without any functioning government agencies or organized relief efforts, survivors begin creating their own systems for distributing food, treating the injured, and clearing paths through the debris. It's remarkable how quickly people can shift from being passive recipients of civilization's benefits to active creators of new social structures when the old ones collapse. But here's what makes the Lisbon earthquake historically significant beyond its immediate devastation. It doesn't just destroy buildings and kill people. It fundamentally alters the way Europeans think about the world and their place in it. The philosophical earthquake that began in the minds of traumatized survivors spreads across the continent through letters, newspapers, and the accounts of foreign residents who witnessed the disaster. Before November 1st, 1755, most educated Europeans subscribed to what philosophers call optimism. Not the casual positive thinking we mean by that word today, but a sophisticated theological argument that this is the best of all possible worlds because it was created by a perfect God. Bad things might happen to individuals, but they serve some greater cosmic purpose that humans can't fully understand. Everything happens for a reason, and that reason is ultimately good. The Lisbon earthquake demolishes this comfortable worldview like a philosophical tsunami. Here's a disaster that seems to serve no discernible purpose except destruction. It kills the devout and the skeptical equally. It destroys churches with the same indifference it shows to brothels. It strikes on a holy day when people are actively engaged in worship. If this is part of God's perfect plan, then either God's definition of perfect is very different from humanity's, or the plan is too complex for human comprehension to the point of being meaningless. Voltaire, one of the era's most influential thinkers, becomes obsessed with the Lisbon disaster and uses it as ammunition in his attack on philosophical optimism. His poem on the Lisbon disaster, and later his satirical novel Candide, essentially argue that if this is the best of all possible worlds, then the alternatives must be absolutely horrific. The earthquake becomes a symbol for the apparent meaninglessness of human suffering and the inadequacy of traditional religious explanations. Historians still argue whether the Lisbon earthquake directly caused the decline of religious authority in Europe or merely accelerated trends that were already in motion, but there's no question that the disaster serves as a catalyst for new ways of thinking about God nature and human responsibility. If divine providence can't be counted on to prevent meaningless catastrophes, then maybe humans need to take more responsibility for protecting themselves and each other. This shift in thinking contributes to the development of what we now call the social sciences' systematic attempts to understand and predict natural and social phenomena through observation and reason rather than through religious revelation. The earthquake also spurs advances in what would eventually become the science of seismology, as investigators try to understand what actually causes the earth to shake. The political ramifications are equally significant. The Portuguese government's response to the disaster, led by the Marquis of Pombal, becomes a case study in enlightened despotism, the idea that strong, rational leadership can solve social problems more effectively than traditional religious or aristocratic authority. Pombal's systematic approach to rebuilding Lisbon, with its emphasis on earthquake-resistant construction and rational urban planning, represents a new confidence in human ability to improve upon natural and traditional arrangements. But perhaps the most profound change is psychological. Before November 1st, 1755, most Europeans lived with the assumption that their world was fundamentally stable and predictable. Natural disasters were acts of God that served divine purposes, even if those purposes weren't always clear. The Lisbon earthquake introduces a new kind of anxiety into European consciousness, the recognition that catastrophic change can happen suddenly, without warning and without any discernible moral or cosmic significance. This is the birth of what we might call the modern sense of vulnerability, the understanding that civilization is more fragile than it appears, that progress isn't guaranteed, and that humans exist in a universe that's largely indifferent to their hopes and plans. It's a sobering realization, but it's also liberating in its way. If the universe doesn't have a predetermined plan for human happiness, then humans are free to create their own plans. You've survived one of history's great natural disasters, but more than that, you've witnessed the birth of the modern world. The intellectual and emotional frameworks that will shape the next 2 centuries of Western civilization are being forged in the ashes of your destroyed city. The earthquake that shattered your morning prayers has also shattered the old certainties, creating space for new kinds of hope and new kinds of human possibility. The trembling finally stops, the fires eventually die out, and the waters recede back to their proper boundaries. But the questions raised by those terrible 3 days in November continue to reverberate through European thought like endless aftershocks. You close your eyes and try to imagine the Lisbon that will rise from these ashes, more rational in its design, more prepared for disaster, more humble about humanity's place in the cosmic order. It will be a different city built by people who have learned that the ground beneath their feet cannot always be trusted, but who have also discovered that human beings are more resilient and resourceful than they ever imagined. The old world ended on November 1st, 1755, but from its ruins a new kind of civilization is already beginning to grow. Sleep now knowing that even the most catastrophic endings can become the most unexpected beginnings. The earth is still, again the waters have returned to their boundaries, and tomorrow will bring the slow, patient work of rebuilding both cities and certainties. Rest well, survivor of history's most philosophically significant earthquake. You've earned it.